Hello everyone. In this short video we're going to cover Chapter 12, the seafloor. There are some animations in this chapter that are really important to look at, and also video clips. And so for that you're going to have to review the PDF version of this chapter. Here's just a quick summary of the main concepts and ideas in this chapter. So I encourage you to read this and maybe pause the video and then keep these in mind as you're studying this chapter, and that'll help you learn the material better. What we're seeing here is a concept map of sorts. And the main ideas to appreciate here are that we can divide the seafloor up into two main regions, including continental margins and also the deep ocean basins. Among the continental margins, these are the submerged edges of the continents that are underwater. They do form the seafloor, but they have more of a continental affinity than an ocean basin affinity. Among continental margins, we can divide those up into both active and passive. And as we'll see, the main difference between active and passive continental margins is that active margins have plate boundaries, either subduction style or transform style plate boundaries, and passive margins do not. And then later on in the presentation, we'll dive into the deep ocean basins. And the main idea here is that in the deep ocean basins, far from shore, and generally in deeper water, we see a completely different set of seafloor features than we do on the continental margins. So that's another way to organize your thinking in this chapter. Really keep continental margin features separate in your mind from deep ocean basin features. And we're going to discuss all of these features. And then beyond all that, the overall theme of this entire chapter is that we can make sense of the seafloor in all its complexity in light of plate tectonic theory. So whatever we're talking about with regard to the seafloor, we'll always find a way to relate things back to plate tectonic theory. As I mentioned, it's really important in this chapter especially that you go back on your own and you look at the linked video clips and animations in this presentation. In order to do that, you'll need to open the PDF version of this presentation. So I encourage you to do that. Here's a quick review question. What process creates new seafloor? I'll give you a second to decide. And also, what process destroys or recycles old seafloor? Well, how about the process that creates new seafloor? Hopefully you picked the correct answer. That's plate divergence. New seafloor originates at the mid-ocean ridges at divergent plate boundaries. What about the opposite? What process destroys old seafloor or recycles it into the mantle? And that's, of course, plate subduction. On to continental margins. As I mentioned before, we can think of continental margins as the submerged edges of the continents. These are just the parts of the continents that are submerged beneath seawater. And continental margins come in two basic styles, active and passive. And you can see that for active margins, we have active geologic processes, ultimately because we have plate boundaries at active margins. At passive margins, we often lack active geologic processes like earthquakes and volcanoes and faulting and that sort of thing. And ultimately, passive continental margins are passive because they lack a plate boundary. So here again, we're relating continental margins to the presence or the absence of a plate boundary. Here's just a quick map showing the worldwide distribution of both active and passive margins. You can see in general that in the Pacific Ocean, much of the perimeter of the Pacific Ocean basin is characterized by active margins. And then particularly in the Atlantic Ocean basin, much of the perimeter of the Atlantic Ocean basin is characterized by passive margins. Okay, on to the details of passive continental margins. What you're looking at in this diagram is what you would see on the seafloor if you start at the shoreline and then follow the seafloor seaward. When you do that, you'd effectively be on top of an almost flat, slightly seaward sloping platform called the continental shelf. This is where rivers bring sediment into the marine environment, and this is where the water tends to be shallow and nutrient rich, and at least the upper few tens of meters of the water tends to be well lit by sunlight. So actually, this is where the majority of the world's sea life hangs out on what's known as the continental shelf. And that occurs in relatively shallow water, only down to a depth, a maximum depth of a couple of 100 meters. And then when we reach the edge of the continental shelf, that's when things start transitioning very quickly into much deeper water. This area of transition connecting the continental shelf ultimately to the deep ocean basins is known as the continental slope. And then at the base of the continental slope, we have the continental rise, just as it sounds. This is simply where the abyssal plain, which is a deep ocean basin feature we're going to get to later, this is where the abyssal plain kind of rises upward to meet the very edge of the continent. So that's the continental rise. And this transition from continental shelf, continental slope, to continental rise is very characteristic of passive continental margins. And another feature here is what's called the shelf slope break. This is simply the seaward edge of the continental shelf. And you can see the shelf slope break right here. It turns out we know from sonar measurements and also even from direct observation in submersibles that in many places the continental shelf is sort of eroded or notched by steep-walled, deep submarine canyons. And submarine canyons funnel sediment from the shallow marine environment ultimately into the deep marine environment and distribute it ultimately on the abyssal plain. What's going on in the submarine canyons? Well, in some places, the submarine canyon is just the seaward expression of a river valley. So in places where rivers deliver sediment to the marine environment, we can imagine that during the last ice age, for example, when sea level was much, much lower, on the order of 300 or 350 feet lower than it is today, that today's river valleys extended farther out onto the continental shelf. And then around 10 or 11,000 years ago, when the last ice age ended, continental ice sheets largely melted, and that caused sea level to rise hundreds of feet in just a few thousand years, so that former river valleys were drowned, creating submarine canyons. And so one way to think of a submarine canyon is it's simply a drowned river valley. But there are plenty of places where submarine canyons don't line up with onshore river canyons or river valleys. And so we need another explanation to explain the origin of submarine canyons in that case. And a few decades ago, it was discovered that there are these highly energetic, turbulent flows of sediment-laden water that roar down these submarine canyons. They're called turbidity currents. And in particular, I encourage you to go back to the PDF version of this presentation and look at the link for turbidity currents. You'll actually get to see a laboratory-generated turbidity current. It turns out that these turbidity currents, as they funnel sediment-laden water, or really a mixture of sediment and water, down these submarine canyons. They have so much energy they can literally erode their own canyons. And so that seems to solve the mystery of why some submarine canyons don't line up with onshore rivers. These submarine canyons can often be cut by the turbidity currents that flow within them. And then where the submarine canyons open up onto the sea floor, this is where we get underwater versions of alluvial fans. We call these deep sea fans. They're sometimes called abyssal fans. One last thing I'll say about this diagram is that when you see it drawn over on the right, it's highly exaggerated vertically. So in this case, the vertical scale has been dramatically stretched with regard to the horizontal scale. And so it gives an unrealistic sense of the types of slopes that we're dealing with. This is only done in this case to emphasize relatively subtle features on the seafloor. And I just want to mention before we move on that if we were to draw this diagram with no vertical exaggeration, that is, if we were to draw it with the horizontal and the vertical scales at the same scale, then the shelf and the slope, for example, would look very similar. But there is still, even still, a notable difference in slope between the continental shelf and the continental slope. And then again, at the base of the continental slope, where things kind of flatten out and join the abyssal plain, that's called the continental rise. Most importantly, passive continental margins are not characterized by a plate boundary. So we certainly have a geologic boundary here between continental crust and oceanic crust, but in this case, the oceanic crust is fused to the continental crust and we don't have a plate boundary. That's the main thing that you want to remember about passive continental margins, is because they lack plate boundaries, they don't tend to be sites of active geologic activity in terms of faulting and volcanism and earthquakes, mountain building, etc. This is what turbidity current deposits look like when they're compacted and cemented and lithified into sedimentary rock. You get these nicely layered rocks that in fact are called turbidites. And this is an actual exposure of marine turbidites about 2 hours east of San Diego in the Anza-Borrego Desert. And typically turbidites will develop on the surfaces of submarine fans, like we talked about in the last slide. All right, well, if passive continental margins aren't places where active plate boundaries occurred, what actually creates them? Well, it turns out that even though passive margins lack plate boundaries, they're still created by a plate boundary process, namely continental rifting. So when one continent breaks up into two or more continents, that process is called continental rifting. It's essentially continent-continent plate divergence, like we see happening here. And in this case, the break hasn't yet occurred. And in this middle slide, it's almost occurred. And then in the bottom slide, the break has now occurred. We've turned one continent into two separate continents with a widening ocean basin in between. And then on either side, we have a passive continental margin. So the take-home message here is that we can understand the origin of passive continental margins as a result of plate tectonic processes, in this case, plate divergence. Here's another concept check. Let's go through this. So study the seafloor map. Why is it that the oceanic rock, that is the colored rock on that seafloor map, is so much younger than the continental rock? On average, you can see here that seafloor rock is only a couple of 100 million years old or less, but particularly in continental interiors, we find rocks that can be billions of years old. So why that age discrepancy between very old rocks on the continents and much younger rocks in the ocean basins? I'll give you a second to see if you can select all of the answers that apply here. So there we go. There are really two reasons why oceanic rock is much younger than continental rock. Number one, new oceanic rock is constantly forming at the mid-ocean ridges. So that keeps the rock young, as it were. But just as importantly, older oceanic rock is being subducted and recycled into Earth's interior, whereas you might remember from the chapter on plate tectonic theory that continental rock in general is too buoyant to subduct. So once it forms, it pretty much hangs around for much longer periods of time, geologically speaking. Okay, on to subduction style active margins. In this case, we have an ocean continent subduction zone, and these are features that generally typify subduction style active margins. We of course get active mountain building because of plate convergence, and because we have a plate boundary here along the continental margin, we get earthquakes and active faulting. And then particularly for subduction style active margins, it turns out that we tend to get a very narrow continental shelf versus a much wider continental shelf for passive margins. Another style of active margin is what's called a transform style margin. And the main place on Earth today where we have a transform style active margin is right off of our own coast. The coast and the seafloor just off the coast of Southern California can be described in terms of a sort of wide, mushy transform plate boundary. So onshore, we have all of these active faults. These are the faults that I've highlighted in red. We have the San Andreas fault to the east. This is the San Jacinto fault zone. West of the San Andreas, we have the Elsinore fault zone that runs through Julian. And even in metropolitan San Diego, we have the RCF, that stands for Rose Canyon fault zone. If you've ever driven Highway 5 from Highway 52 into downtown, you're pretty much driving right on top of the Rose Canyon fault zone. All of these onshore faults are active, meaning they're capable of producing big earthquakes, big damaging earthquakes, and they're all examples of right lateral strike-slip faults. And the reason is that they reflect the overall sideways plate motion regionally between the North American plate to the east and the Pacific plate to the west. But because this is a chapter on the seafloor, let's turn our attention to the seafloor just west of Southern California. And what we find here is that the active faults continue out into the continental margin area west of Southern California. So we have, for example, the Coronado Bank fault zone, the San Diego Trough fault zone, the Santa Cruz Island fault zone. This unlabeled fault zone is the Santa Catalina Island fault zone, and many others. Just like onshore faults, all of these faults are right lateral strike-slip faults. They're all capable of generating large earthquakes, perhaps up to magnitude 7 or 7.5. And they're ultimately a reflection of the wide, mushy plate boundary, the transform boundary we have in this area. So as you might expect, we don't tend to get too much volcanism, really no active volcanism on the seafloor of Southern California, because this is a transform boundary. It's not a divergent boundary, nor is it a subduction zone. So although we do get active plate boundary processes, earthquakes and mountain building, we don't so much see much in the way of active volcanism. Okay, now we're going to shift our attention to the deep ocean basins. Now we're going to move out far away from the continental margins, generally into much deeper water. And we're first going to concentrate on the largest, most regionally extensive features of all. These are known in general as the mid-ocean ridges. So let me circle the mid-ocean ridge in both of these diagrams. Here are the mid-ocean ridges. And you know by now in the course that the mid-ocean ridges are simply sites of plate divergence. So we have two plates moving away from each other at the mid-ocean ridge. And something that we haven't really talked about yet in the course that I do want to address in this lecture is the fact that for many of the world's mid-ocean ridges, we see a deep cleft. We see a deep tectonic valley running right down the middle of the ridge. This is sometimes known as the Rift Valley or also the Axial Valley. And it was only as recently as 1977 or 1978 that the first submersibles actually visited the Rift Valley in the middle of the mid-ocean ridge. And when we got there, researchers were quite surprised to form these very interesting kind of tall, narrow chimneys belching out what looked like out of the porthole of the submersible to be black smoke. And when they probed these areas a little bit more, the researchers realized that the so-called black smokers were actually undersea hydrothermal vents. They were gushing out a mixture of superheated seawater and also lots of different minerals. And so it's the sulfur-based and the iron-based minerals in the hot water that are clouding the water, making it look like black smoke, although it's not really black smoke. And as the hot water cools, minerals are chemically deposited, that is precipitated along the sides of the hydrothermal vent, and you get these tall chimneys. In some places, researchers found that these chimneys were 3 and 4 and 5 stories tall. They're shaped more like a telephone pole than a typical volcano. They're kind of tall and narrow, not necessarily conical at their base. So anyways, that was a complete surprise to find these black smokers inside the Axial Valley. And I really encourage you here to go back on your own in the PDF version of this presentation and look at this short video clip so you can see some actual footage of an erupting black smoker. Again, I want to emphasize we're not looking at lava here. We're looking at a mixture of superheated water, several hundred degrees in fact, in combination with sulfur and iron-bearing minerals. And then perhaps even more surprising, these first researchers to visit the Axial Valley of the mid-ocean ridges discovered a whole ecosystem of new organisms unknown to science living within a few meters of the black smokers, these hydrothermal vents. And one of the more intriguing life forms they discovered were these so-called tube worms. So here's a photograph of the tube worms. They live on the flanks of these black smokers, where the water is still quite hot, by the way. And what's so interesting about these tube worms, and you'll learn all about this if you explore the links here and here in the PDF version, is these tube worms essentially are just passive hosts for what are called chemosynthetic bacteria. And what the bacteria have learned to do is to accomplish a sort of modified version of photosynthesis underwater. And the way they do that is by harvesting energy not from the sun, that would be photosynthesis, but these specialized bacteria are actually harvesting energy from these sulfur-based minerals. And the actual chemical the bacteria are using to essentially make their own food is hydrogen sulfide. So the bacteria harvest energy associated with hydrogen sulfide molecules, and they convert that energy into food, essentially. And what was so amazing about this is it was discovered that entire ecosystems living within a few meters of these black smokers depend on this process known as chemosynthesis rather than photosynthesis. So again, if you're interested, I encourage you to go back to the PDF version of this presentation and click right here for a brief discussion of the fascinating biology of tube worms. It turns out that they're red because they possess a molecule called hemoglobin, we have that same molecule in our blood. The hemoglobin molecule is very good at collecting oxygen from the seawater and delivering the oxygen to these chemosynthetic bacteria. So effectively, what we have going on here are two organisms living as one. The chemosynthetic bacteria live inside the tube worms, and each organism benefits the other. It's an example of what biologists call mutualistic symbiosis, two organisms living together as one for mutual benefit. And kind of amazing that this organism was unknown to science until the late 1970s. Okay, back to the geologic structure beneath the mid-ocean ridge. It turns out that the mid-ocean ridges on either side of the axial valley are bordered by dip-slip faults in the subsurface. This is where active earthquake activity occurs. Keep in mind that this is a cross-section. This is a vertical slice. It's like you're looking at a wall here of the interior of the mid-ocean ridge. Can you recognize what type of faults these are? What does that imply about the regional tectonic stress happening in this area? And from the fact that these are faults, so the rock is breaking, what does that imply about the type of strain behavior going on here? So I'll give you a second to see if you can answer those questions on your own. Okay, what'd you come up with? Well, these are normal faults because keep in mind that if we focus on this fault right here, that this would be the head wall of that fault. This would be the footwall. And you can clearly see in this case along this fault that the head wall is moving down relative to the footwall. So that makes all of these faults bordering the axial valley normal faults. And you might also remember from the chapter on geologic structures that normal faults are associated with horizontal regional tectonic stress. In other words, along this divergent boundary, when the plates are being pulled apart in tension, there's the regional tectonic stress, tensile stress. The rock along the mid-ocean ridge breaks apart along normal faults, and it's actually the normal faults themselves that accommodate the extension in this case. And because the normal faults are breaking the rock, they're an example of brittle strain behavior. Well, another prominent feature that we see on the seafloor, actually two prominent features, are called transform faults and fracture zones. And the basic distinction is that transform faults are plate boundaries. Up until now, we've been referring to these as transform plate boundaries. And you'll notice that transform faults always occur in between two mid-ocean ridge segments. So it's only in between the two mid-ocean ridge segments on this diagram that we find a transform fault. However, if we go to the side of the transform fault over here and over here, we still find areas of cracking and breakage on the seafloor. These are known as fracture zones. And I've highlighted a couple of fracture zones in this Google Earth image of the seafloor in the middle of the North Atlantic Ocean. We've actually covered all this previously in Chapter 2. We're just using slightly different vocabulary here. And you can see below, here's a simplified version of this diagram. You probably remember from the chapter on plate tectonics, again, that it's only in between two mid-ocean ridges where we have the transform plate boundary. And the only difference here in this chapter is we're just calling attention to this transform plate boundary because it's a prominent seafloor feature that researchers refer to as a fracture zone. And it turns out that fracture zones used to be transform plate boundaries that have simply become deactivated as a result of continued plate motion. So the bottom line, and again, this is review, is that transform faults always occur in between two mid-ocean ridge segments. And also transform faults are just another name for transform plate boundaries. The fracture zones occur on the sides, the flanks of transform faults. And they were once transform faults that have subsequently become deactivated. And the main distinction between fracture zones and transform faults is that fracture zones are not plate boundaries. So make sure you're really clear on the geometry here and the distinction between transform faults and fracture zones. And let's get some practice here. So again, here's a Google Earth image of the seafloor in the Atlantic Ocean basin off the east coast, that is east of the east coast of North America. So looking at that image, can you tell which dashed box would surround the transform fault? I'll give you a second to answer. Hopefully you answered correctly. It's box 2, because again, it's only box 2 that's in between the two mid-ocean ridge segments here and here. Segments 1 and 3, by the way, are fracture zones. They occur on the flanks of the transform fault. And again, the main distinction here is that fracture zones are not plate boundaries, whereas transform faults are plate boundaries. Not really going to have much to emphasize on this diagram except to say that if we could slice the seafloor open and look at a theoretical cross-section, it seems to be the case that the crystalline bedrock beneath the sediments tends to be mafic to ultramafic in composition. We get gabbro and peridotite, which are ultramafic rocks. And then at the surface, right on the seafloor, and in the shallow subsurface, we get an underwater version of basalt. These are essentially underwater pahoehoe flows, and they develop these sort of bulbous, rounded, sometimes kind of oblong or spherical structures that are collectively called pillow basalt. And then in the very upper portion of this theoretical cross-section, the pillow basalt is itself covered up, overlain by marine sediments that are covering up the pillow basalt, covering up the crystalline rock like a snowfall. All right, well, if we go far enough offshore of the continental margins, we come to the flattest places on Earth called the abyssal plains. So here's a Google Earth image of the abyssal plain, and then these are two different photographs taken from submersibles of what abyssal plains actually look like. They're not very rich in life, at least large life forms like fish, etc. Although the mud of the abyssal plains contains a high biodiversity of microbes, we've recently learned. But in general, we're in pretty deep water in this case, an average depth of 3 to 6 kilometers. And we know from drill cores and other data sets that the average thickness of abyssal plain sediments is on the order of 450 meters or so. It's possible to bounce seismic waves from the sea floor through these abyssal plain sediments and back up to the surface. And by doing this in many places, setting off explosive charges on the sea floor, it's actually possible to map the irregular volcanic topography underneath the abyssal plain sediments. So when I said in the last slide that the abyssal plain sediments sort of cover up the irregular volcanic bedrock like a snowfall, hopefully you can see what I mean here. Again, the abyssal plains are the flattest places on Earth, but that flatness is a little bit deceiving because if you drill down through it, if you remove the marine sediments on the floor of the abyssal plain, you would eventually move into this very irregular volcanic crystalline bedrock that originated at the mid-ocean ridges. A few other deep ocean basin features before we wrap things up. Anytime you have an underwater mountain with the summit of the mountain that doesn't crest sea level, in other words, if the mountain doesn't stick up above sea level, we call it somewhat generically a seamount. And in some places, we find that these seamounts have flat tops. In this case, they're called geos. And the origin of geos is kind of intriguing. Geos were once volcanic islands that stuck up above sea level. And then as the island itself moved off of the magma source, either away from a mantle plume perhaps, or away from a divergent boundary, wave erosion essentially beveled the island flat at about sea level. And then as this oceanic plate moves away from the eruptive center, it cools off, and as it cools off, it shrinks and compresses, and that in effect pulls the geo into deeper and deeper and deeper water. So in this diagram down here, this would be a geo, this would be a geo, this would be a geo, and these two volcanoes, an active volcano and an inactive volcano, would be oceanic islands. And then trenches. In this case, I like to lump in trenches with deep ocean basin features because obviously they're the deepest places on planet Earth. And just like we've done for many of the other features in this diagram, we can relate the trenches to plate tectonic theory in a very simple and straightforward way. The trenches are simply the place on the seafloor where we have a subduction zone boundary. So where an oceanic plate dives underneath either another oceanic plate or a continental plate, we get these deep, steep-walled, trough-like features on the seafloor called trenches. And they are literally places where the deepest seafloor on planet Earth occurs, deeper than anywhere else. And the deepest trench is in the Pacific Ocean. It's near the Mariana Islands, the southern tip of the Mariana Islands, known as the Challenger Deep, and it's almost 11,000 meters below sea level.